Today's scripture lesson comes to us from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 22. The chapter splits between two different things. One, the beginning of the chapter is an end of dialogue of a bunch of parables of Jesus, which the last one is the parable of the wedding banquet, the world to come. And then it switches almost to a courtroom drama where Jesus is confronted by Pharisees and asks a series of questions. One is, do you pay taxes to Caesar? And he shows they should ask for a coin. And then questions about the resurrection with the Sadducees there, saying, well, is there really the resurrection or not? And Jesus' answers to that one kind of dumbfounds them as well. And then the third one is the one we're going to read today, which is the Great Commandment, or as our Pew Bible says, the greatest commandment. Here are these words from chapter 22, verses 34. When the Pharisees heard he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him this question to test him. Teacher, which commandment of the law is greatest? And he said to him, you shall love your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Of these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And now while the Pharisees were questioning together, Jesus asked them a question. What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? And they said, the son of David. And he said to them, now so it is that David by the Spirit called him Lord, saying, Lord, say to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I'll put my enemies under your feet. And if David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? And no one was able to answer him, nor did they from that day forward dare to ask him any more questions. We live in a tough time. We do. We live in a tough time. And a lot of things are happening around us that love seems to be diminished. And it's hard to uphold the flag of love in a diminished time. So I believe that the first commandment, everyone placates to it. Oh yeah, I love God. You can go ask the leaders of Hamas if they love God. Yeah. You can ask the leaders of Israel, do they love God? Yeah. You can ask the leaders of Russia, do they love God? Oh yeah. You can ask the leaders of Ukraine, do you love God? Yeah. You can ask the new chair of the House if he loves God. He would say so. But in the implementation of what love is, things fall down really, really quickly. And in fact, I would say that the hardest commandment there is the second one, to love your neighbor. It's where it all falls apart. It's all great to say I love God because God's ethereal, God's out there. God doesn't require us to confront God directly. The great creator of the universe is there around us, ever present, changing the world and nature, and just so much so as easy as our breathing in and out. But when it comes to nature and neighbors, we are confronted with the reality that people are not easy to love, and that our neighbor often gets in the way of the way we want the world to be. It's that simple. If we could define the world the way we want it to be, and our neighbors would do everything we want them to do, it would be easy to love our neighbor. They're just going to do what I want them to do. The problem is they have their own initiative. They have their own way of thinking about things, and they may not agree with us, which proves that they really aren't our neighbor, and that we should be able to do to them anything we want because they're really not our neighbor. It's a hard proposition that extends out, and it becomes even more dicey when you decide whose group you're going to have as your neighbor. The protests about Palestine, the protests of people of Israel have been knocking against each other, each one claiming the moral high ground, saying, well, our group is better than your group, and your group should be held accountable. If we want to go to Russia and Ukraine, that's an easy one to do too. And what about those poor people who were murdered this week in Maine? Who was their neighbor? Who was sticking up for them now that their lives are gone and their families are grieving this great, great loss? Who is their neighbor too? I am convinced that the church is one of the last places within our society that takes serious the idea of neighbor. Most of us belong to things that affiliate with our point of view in the world, whether it's a political party or a nonprofit or anything else. Churches, we do that somewhat, but no matter what we do in a church, whether it's conservative or liberal, we're going to run into people who don't hold the same opinion as we do, and we're going to get confronted with neighborliness. I don't really like the way they see the world. Are they my neighbor too? You know, Fred Rogers made a whole career of asking who their neighbor was, didn't he? He just, had the song, the whole thing. And it was easy for us to say, oh, the children, of course, we're going to talk about being neighbors. But as we got to be adults, we don't see much neighborliness. Don't see it in Congress. We don't see it with people who don't particularly care our point of view. We don't really work on that as a great concern of ours. Yet the church still works on that. It still tries to understand who the neighbors are in the world, and it reflects back to the greatest commandment. If we're really believing that God is the one who's overarching, the one we love with a full heart, the one that we really want to try to emulate, then who's God's neighbor? We have to ask that question. And if we're honest to say that if God, the creator of all of this, believes his creative power is to all of us, then we have to say, well, God's neighbor is everybody and everything. And how are we going to act in a world that keeps cutting those neighborly things short? The church is one of those things in this whole milieu of living that still harkens back to what God's neighborliness is. We are confronted all the time with the world that we live in with that idea of who is our neighbor? Who do we love? Who do we support? Who do we want to be a part of? Over and over again, we don't get through a whole stinking week here without confronting that in some way or another. We who follow Jesus have to really confront it in unique ways too, because he reached out to the people who were untouchable. He reached out to women and men who were in distress. He even reached out to people who were dead to say that God is your neighbor and I am your neighbor too. During this time, we're in the season of stewardship. We have just started fire again. We're off to the races. 4 weeks of it. That's all you have to put up with. 4 weeks of stewardship, and then we'll take your pledge, and we'll be good for another year, and you won't have to think about money ever again. That is overselling a promise, I'll tell you. But it's important for us to recognize that we as a congregation necessarily require that people think of their life here as neighbors to one another and as a way of supporting one another and supporting this congregation through our material means, through our time, and through our talent to really make this community grow, be vibrant, make a difference in the world that we are in, both globally and locally. We need to know that we are a key member of God's work in this place. And so as we struggle with neighborliness as a congregation, as we struggle as individuals in the world in saying, well, who's my neighbor? How do I react to this? A couple of things I think came to mind for me. When Hamas originally attacked into Israel and the Jewish community was completely shaken, sometimes being a neighbor is just standing in solidarity with people and saying, this must be really hard for you. When the Palestinians now with Israeli incursion, where innocent people are losing their lives, we need to stand with people like that and say, this is a really difficult time, and political situations are causing us to go in directions we really don't like. We need to stand with you. With the people in Maine who have lost their loved ones because someone with a gun killed them. We need to stand with families and say, we stand with you because we're your neighbor. We put a peace pole up in the entryway last week. And if you walk around it, you'll notice that there are 7 different languages that are all asking for peace in the world. And we have to be serious about that, because if we're really going to be peacemakers in the world, we have to understand that these people are our neighbors as well, and that their hurt is our hurt. And though we can't solve every problem from this location, we can at least be engaged spiritually with the world for the sake of peace. Those are the things that stewardship gives us in this congregation. Our time, our talent, our prayers, our interest, the joy that we have in living are all part of who we are at First Christian Church Pomona. And we reach out into communities that we don't really have a lot in, but they are our neighbors. Part of the open and affirming statement we say every week is because we say that we need to be aligned. We need to show that we care for dispossessed communities in our midst, for people who are struggling. We care, and it makes a difference for us to offer God's grace and welcome in this place. We've started a season of stewardship. Where will it lead you? And who is your neighbor? Will you pray with me? It's a difficult, some would say a hard commandment to believe that all those people and all those situations and even the world itself is our neighbor, that we need to give ourselves over to things that are hard for us as well as the things that are easy. As we make a list of who our neighbor is, God, please expand it for ourselves, that we might be in solidarity with those who hurt, find joy with those who have conquered great things. And please, God, give us the vision to see your world where peace will reign. Amen.